Welcome to the Grief Dreams podcast, where we have conversations with guests about their life, loss, grief, and of course, grief dreams, which can be dreams of the deceased. If you want to know more about the topic and your host, please visit the website griefdreams.ca. To support the podcast, please go ahead and rate it. For additional ways to support the show, please see the episode show notes. Before I move on with the show, I would like to give a territory acknowledgement. Long before Canada was formed, the Stalo people were the original land stewards, and they have lived here since time immemorial. They continue to live in the unceded Stalo territory known to settlers as the Fraser Valley and Lower Fraser Canyon of British Columbia. I recognize and honor the contribution that Indigenous peoples have made and continue to make to our community and the topic of grief dreams. Welcome to the Grief Dreams podcast. Thank you again for tuning in. And so today we have Marney Thompson on the podcast. So Marney is the Director of Bereavement Services at Victoria Hospice and an executive member of the Canadian Grief Alliance. She is the recent recipient of the King Charles Coronation Medal in recognition of her contribution to the field of bereavement care. She is an experienced conference presenter, clinical co-lead of the BC Psychosocial ECHO project, and a counselor in private practice. In addition to these roles, she is also co-author of the award-winning book, Transitions in Dying and Bereavement, and a number of peer-reviewed articles related to psychosocial palliative care, medical assistance in death, and prolonged grief. In 2012, she was part of the International Train the Trainers pilot project with the Center for Prolonged Grief at Columbia University and has continued to work and study in this area of grief. So thank you, Marney, for coming on the podcast. I've been looking forward to this episode. We know each other just in our professional lives. And so I'm really excited you came on the podcast. We'll talk about some of the stuff that you're working on.
Thank you, Joshua. Me too. You and I always have lots to talk about.
And so I'm really curious. I don't think I've ever heard the story of how did you get into the grief space? For me, it was like my dad died and then I volunteered at a hospice and kind of like the path opened up. I'm just really curious, what was your path on how you really got here to really make change in this field?
What a great question. And I wish I had a on the nose brief answer like yours. I was a sick kid. In high school, I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease and spent a lot of time in hospital, in and out of hospital, and many surgeries, and got to know, of course, all the other kind of majorly chronically ill kids. And of course, in that time, Joshua, as happens, I would have roommates very sick, and I can think of two who died. And there were no kind of conversations around me about, you've had this roommate for 28 days and they left in the night and never came back. And so just really being interested in experiences of illness and health and frailty and vulnerability, and also how we talk about death and dying, particularly at that time with young people and kids. So, I think from probably age 15, death and grief literacy has been a soapbox for me. And so I started out in my undergraduate years doing a practicum at Victoria Hospice and then just hung on as a volunteer and then a counselor, and probably the last 15 or so years working exclusively in bereavement.
Wow. That's a really interesting story and how you had to deal with it so early in life in a world where it's not where it is today when it comes to grief literacy and honoring children's grief. And so I'm really curious to sort of have your perspective on how much has changed in that time. Like, I'm pretty new to the field, I would say, where I'm just learning more and more about the research, but there is a lot, out there. We can always do more, of course, but I'm coming into the grief space with at least there's some acknowledgement of it. You came from a different time where it was much different. And so could you talk about maybe some of the changes that you've seen?
Mm-hmm. This seems like a small thing and not many things, but I would say, Joshua, the most important shift that I've noticed is more openness. Not necessarily more skill, not more resources, both of which I would love, but certainly on the part of professionals leading with kind of openness and curiosity to be having conversations about end of life, about illness, about dying, about grief in a way that we didn't at all before. So yeah, I see that kind of curiosity and openness really shifting in the professional space in healthcare and health supports. And what I see kind of in the general public space is a more kind of leaning in, like, I know that this is a normal part of life. It's something that's happening to me and the people around me and the people I'm close to, but still not sure what is the right way. There's kind of some awkwardness and uneasiness around how to step into conversations that we might kind of have labeled as difficult or personal or private. So just, I think more and more people aware and open, but still really looking for tools, skills, resources, wanting to kind of build capacity.
As you were saying, people may be curious, but they don't know what to say or how to sort of be a support. And so, what is maybe a couple things that could help those people as they sort of move forward to trying to become, I guess, a better support for people who are grieving? Is there certain things that you like to sort of tell people if they want to be a better support, but they just don't know how?
I guess one of the things that comes to mind as you're framing that question for me, Joshua, is these are the conversations that matter. These are the topics of most importance in our lives. And bringing those to the surface and sharing those with another human being is so like connecting and so bond building. And I think in this world, as we're increasingly on our phones and in a kind of virtual space, things that build connection are so important. And so those things that are inside of you or that you're curious about the experience of someone else, stepping into those are what build connection and intimacy between us. And man, we need that. So I think that's the one thing I would say. And the other thing that I notice I say a lot in my clinical practice in grief is, by asking someone, hey, I heard that your mom is very seriously ill. How's it going? Or it's been a year since your brother died. What's happening with that? By leaning into those conversations, it is not that we're kind of bringing pain or hard or sad onto somebody. It's there anyway. It's inside of them. And so I think by inviting a dialogue, by engaging with someone around these hard topics, you're really decreasing isolation and normalizing their experience. I very often hear from grieving people how they feel like they're on another planet. They're in grief world and the rest of their lives are kind of just going on as if normal, but they really feel kind of pulled out of and suspended from normal life. And so I think when you name their experience, when you ask about their loss or their illness or what's happening that's hard, it kind of reconnects them to this world and other human beings in a way that is just, so reinforcing in terms of our human nature and our need for contact and connection. So those two things, like these are the topics that matter, be brave. And also you're not kind of doing this to the person. If you ask about it and they get upset, that upsets inside of them anyway. And this is just an opportunity to share it with another human being instead of carry it secretly alone.
Wow. Yeah, I really like that. And it's so true. Like a lot of times, even with me, I hold like a sadness, but when someone asks, like something comes out, but I also feel vulnerable, which I'm trying to like also work on, but also how beautiful it is when someone can be there in your vulnerability. Because I think a lot of times in my past, personally, when I was vulnerable, I didn't get that kind of support. And so you kind of learn that it's unsafe to be that. And so it's really beautiful when you can find friends and people that provide that or, volunteers or, any staff. Like when you're vulnerable, they hold it and you're teaching you that it's safe to do so. I think
Yeah.
that's a beautiful thing that I'm learning, right? Constantly learning.
Yeah, and it's a tricky thing to navigate when you're carrying pain, whatever kind of grief that is, whether it's and your own illness experience and end of life experience or the loss of somebody or anticipated loss of somebody. It's a really precarious time, I think, as a human being, because we all have had those experiences where we do open the window or open the door a little bit and share some of that sadness or what we're struggling with someone else. And our worlds are really kind of almost reflexively programmed to deflect, distract, or fix. And in those moments where you come forward with some sadness or something that you're suffering, we don't very often, and certainly not right out of the gate, need or want a fix or a solution or to be kind of fluffed up and bright-sided. So I think you've touched on something so important around just our own awkwardness and literacy or awareness around what do you do with someone's painful, sad, suffering experience? How do we respond in kind of the most loving, compassionate, caring way? And I remember a million years ago, Joshua, we had a volunteer trainer at our hospice. And I remember him saying to the group, stop worrying about what you're going to say and focus on how you're listening. And I think that's so important. I think the most valuable thing we can give someone in a difficult experience is kind of compassionate listening. We don't have to have an answer. We don't have to make it better. We don't have to tell them our story as a comparison, but really just to be like, I'm here with you. Tell me more. How is that happening? What's going on? And just giving that person sort of uncensored space to say, I'm really sad or I'm really lonely, and just to be a witness to it. Because I think in our world, there's so much pressure to kind of hurry up, get better, be happy, that if you can give that to a grieving person, that's bonus. That's the right place to start.
So true. I see that too. And I love how you brought up the fixing thing, 'cause I think that's where a lot of people get stuck in. Like, oh, how am I supposed to fix their grief? And they use kind of that word as if they're going to be like the pinnacle to shift. And as you're saying, like, that's not the goal. The goal is just to allow people to feel heard. And your job is to listen and to ask meaningful questions about their experience. And I think that, it's such a simple thing that I've learned too. And it's just, but you're like, oh, that's all that is required of you. And it kind of reduces the pressure to be something more. And I think the reality I see is that a lot of people just don't have that in their life, right? They have the people who try to fix them or try to rush them. And so they have to pretend, but they're not well, right? They have a lot of grief inside themselves. It's like, who can I outlet this to where I'm heard and listened to? And so it's so important to be able to be that person for people. Even when I say I'll meet people just randomly and I talk about like the topic of grief dreams and stuff. And it's amazing like how much comes out when you talk about the subject. And I just learned to be able to just listen and how appreciative they are for those moments. And I'm like, wow, like I didn't really do anything, but I did something. There's one of those weird kind of paradoxes where like I feel I did very little, but they feel I've done like the world in a way.
I bet. And you talk about kind of the learning journey that you've been on, Joshua, but I would bet money that kind of your researcher mind, your researcher brain is just such a huge asset in terms of you supporting people to tell their stories, because you present with curiosity and openness and interest in what other people are saying. And that's so different than the majority of response that grieving people get, who may experience others sort of stepping back and being overwhelmed or trying to kind of shut it down and tidy it up. I think your natural curiosity and willingness to know and to learn is, that's 100% of what we need as we're listening to grief.
And so I want to move forward to the Canadian Grief Alliance. I know this is a big thing. I'm excited for it. We have something in Canada that's trying to put the spotlight on grief and bereavement and raise awareness of it. And so have you been a part of this since the beginning?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, no way. Oh, that's wild. One of the founding
Mm-hmm.
members. Okay. Okay. So recently you've published the Next Steps Action Plan. So a strategic approach to grief literacy and grief support in Canada. And so I'm just curious, like what was the need to do this and what did you find from that?
Well, I think, this Canadian Grief Alliance started with a few of us on a Zoom call at the beginning of COVID, anticipating like this is going to have a huge impact on dying and death and grief in our world. And what should we do about it? And really kind of gave us the motivation to come together and to try and understand this experience that we're going through and how it might impact resources and needs in our country. And so we did a lot of things. We talked to a million different organizations and agencies and individuals across the country. But one of the things that came out that we did, Joshua, as you know, is our National Grief Survey. And I think a big part of what we learned from that survey, with over 3,000 people responding, was that people really weren't feeling well supported in their grief. That the places that they were turning to were friends and family, of course, neighbors, family physicians, grief counselors, hospices, but there wasn't really any gold star in any of those areas in terms of how supported people felt. And so that got us really interested in thinking about, what can we be doing as the Canadian Grief Alliance to lift up the support, raise up the support that people are feeling in our country, and maybe shine a spotlight on some areas that we really put forth as recommendations for growth in our country. People liked when people asked them about their grief. I mean, I think that's something important to say nationally, that as much as I think we might think, oh, I better not ask my neighbor about her husband who died last month because it'll get her upset. What we learned in our survey was that people appreciated being asked and being able to talk about their loss. So yeah, just doing surveys, learning and hearing from people who are grieving, as you've done at the BC Centre as well, but also talking to professionals and organizations that are grief involved in some way and hearing what the gaps and needs are that they were seeing. And, I think another really important discovery that any and all of us long-timers in grief in Canada were kind of surprised to notice, but also not, was just how we're all kind of functioning in our own little ponds, doing what we can, and don't have much of a network to connect across the country with, oh, in Ontario, they're doing this great thing to support grief in their communities, or in BC, the BC Centre's doing this work. And so trying to build a bit of a network across the country around who's doing what, with what, for who, so that we can grow together with each other and build on the work that has already been done in different pockets of the country.
That's amazing. I feel that there are other countries that have done something similar or ahead of us when it comes to having a national kind of plan and resources for grief and bereavement. So it's nice how we're at the starting blocks of like really trying to get more awareness of it. And one of the things that you've done was built a website about grief.ca, which I think is really cool because you're always looking for quick resources you can give people to learn more about grief. Like that's what like my mind is. 'Cause I'm not here to support you for your entire life, but like there's things you can do, or if you're trying to support someone else, there's things I can point you to. There, it's not like I have to teach you kind of thing. And so I really like that you've developed this website and it has from a Canadian perspective with experts in the field to really allow people to feel that the information that they're getting is accurate. And I think there's so many websites out there, it's hard to know what's what because sometimes you get different kind of answers to it. And so I'm really happy you've built that. And so can you talk about this website a little bit? And I think it just recently was launched, right, this year.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking and giving me a chance to talk about it, because I think it's one of the proudest accomplishments of the Canadian Grief Alliance. So the About Grief website, Joshua, was in our minds from the very beginning. We really wanted a kind of national hub for both grief care provider people, but also the bereaved or grieving general public. And so we had in our minds really from the beginning that we wanted to build something. And we knew we wanted it to include a kind of map of the country function so that wherever you were, you could kind of type in, I'm in Victoria, BC, and I'm looking for this, and have the website kind of do the work of pulling forward for you what's available in your community. So that feature in particular of the About Grief website was really important to us from the beginning, some kind of map that pulled together who's doing what. And we invited all the grief people we talked to make themselves known and on our website. But we also did a lot of research in the country to find out who's doing what and what's there. So does it show everything? Probably not. But is it pretty comprehensive? I think so. And certainly has capacity to keep getting built. So people in rural and remote communities can look up their areas or what's available to them and find some good support resources. So that kind of national atlas around bereavement supports available was really important. There's also a ton of excellent content on the Canadian Grief Alliance About Grief website that can be filtered according to the nature of the loss, the nature of the relationship, but also, I think, really important and different than a lot of grief websites, certainly in Canada, but even internationally. It includes grief related to non-death loss. So loss of a job, end of a relationship, grief related to immigration. There's content there for different kinds of non-death related grief experiences, which I think is really important. So there's content, there's the atlas, there's also a place where grief providers or community members can make us know about innovations that are happening. So I think of the Grief Matters events in Nova Scotia that go on and all of the cool kind of community-based projects that they're doing around grief literacy. So I think that's a great place for just the general public and community members, but also grief care providers to get some really good ideas about how to engage with grief in their communities. And then the last thing, and it's probably not the last thing about the About Grief website, but I wanted to mention is the grief assistant function. So there's a feature on the About Grief website with this little ear on each page where you can actually write in a question about your experience of grief. And it might be about resources. It might be about, is this normal? It might be, my mom's going through this. How can I be helpful? And that feature, that grief assistant function, pulls from all of the material in our website and also a number of other kind of vetted grief resources in the country and abroad around good grief literate information and crafts a response. And it's a dialogue that you can have with this grief assistant. So you might have your first question and get some response and then keep refining, and it stays with you and keeps pulling resources. So it might be, okay, that's what I can do. Who in my community is teaching that, or where's the support for that? And it'll kind of keep pulling information forward.
That's so interesting and so innovative. I'm never sure how you thought about that. I tried it a little bit with when it came to questions on grief dreams and did pretty
Oh,
good.
good.
Yeah. I
Good.
was actually
What did you think?
I thought it was good. It was simple enough to allow people to feel that whatever they're experiencing was normal and it's okay. And so for me, I'm like, that is a great response. I've heard a lot of bad responses when people
Yeah.
say stuff about or respond to people's dreams. And so it did pretty well. And so I was like, oh, that's interesting that that's a part of it. And it made me sort of think more about AI and grief and how we can utilize it as we move forward, because it's not going away. But it's how can we utilize it within the grief field moving forward? And this is one way. And you said you vetted the sources where it's pulling information from, which I think is a huge thing, rather than just allowing it to run wild on the internet. Which now Chat GPT is doing, it has the whole source, so that it pulls out incorrect information at times. And so it's how can we make sure that the information we're sending people is accurate? And so that's really interesting that you guys chose that way. And I'm really excited to sort of see where it goes and kind of your feedback on it as you move forward, because I think that is something that other organizations and people may utilize moving forward with the way technology is progressing. And so just a quick thing is what are your thoughts about just AI and grief and where we're moving forward to? If you can have basically a grief assistant, could you have a grief counselor one day that's all AI?
It's a great question. And I think it's a broader question as well. Could AI substitute for lots of what are now kind of human-based mental health supports? And I have a computer science student in my house who's very much about, I'm learning LLMs, language learning models. And so we've been having some conversations about counseling and Chat GPT, for example. And, I'm mixed about it, Joshua. I think there's fantastic and wonderful potential. So much of the work of grief, I think for the majority of people, is just normalization and reassurance, because grief is such a fundamentally disruptive experience. When you have a primary loss, a home, a job, a partner, a child, the world kind of gets turned upside down and inside out. That to have access to solid kind of evidence-based information that's reassuring and normalizing and helping people to know how to navigate that experience, I think is so important, especially when we think of people who have difficulty accessing different kinds of healthcare service, and in particular, counseling. That's so limited in our country. And the Canadian Grief Alliance survey was, a lot of people were saying, we want more counseling, more free counseling. But not everybody has access to that. So I think a good system of AI is a fantastic resource for all kinds of marginalized people who may have difficult access, but really for anybody. Part of the experience of big loss at first anyway is just how difficult it is to get out in the world and navigate and advocate for yourself and look for supports and resources. So I think it's fantastic in that way. I worry that the availability of it and the uptake of it is a bit ahead of our thinking around safeguards and guardrails for people. So, part of what happens in most AI experiences is what I think of as, I'm not sure, I'm not that techie, but confirmation bias. So AI tends to kind of reinforce whatever line and language we're putting forward. So my worry is it could be giving bad advice because it's kind of aligned with where is this person coming from and using kind of that line of thinking to align with and respond. So I worry about the kinds of challenging perceptions and challenging ways of thinking and reframing how people are experiencing things. I don't know yet that AI is doing that for us, and I hope we get there. I think that would be fantastic. But in the meantime, I'm really curious and concerned and doing my own thinking and talking around how can we as healthcare providers be helping to inform the people we're caring for about things to keep in mind when they're using AI.
I really appreciate the dual perspective on like some of the benefits, but also some of the challenges moving forward. And you're right, the safeguards are not are not there when it comes to a lot of this stuff, and also the attachment people can get towards it. It reminds me of the movie Inception. I don't know if you've ever seen it with Leonardo DiCaprio.
Probably did, but I don't hold stuff very well.
So basically, he goes into dreams. So that's the whole thing with Inception. So he goes into other people's dreams, and one of the things is that he lost, or he had the death of his partner, and he kept going into a dream world to meet her. So he
Yeah.
got attached to basically doing that. And he couldn't, and it was actually impeding his grief. And so I can see moving forward, if people use VR as a way of maintaining relationships, people could get like it could help certain people. Other people could get very attached, and it could reduce their progress on what they're doing. And they just come fascinated with like growing old together in this other world, right? As a way of like reducing their grief. Yeah, it's going to be interesting to sort of see where this all goes, but we're in a very interesting time where like this is all something that is in the next 5 years. It's going to be all over the place, even more so.
Totally. And I think of that, the idea of a pendulum, right? Where we go way over here and then we learn some things and we come back into the middle or back the other way. What you were talking about in terms of like the Inception movie and going into dreams and kind of being more and more in that dream world and not in the reality world, which I think is even more fuzzy these days. But just, we have a long standing awareness and appreciation in grief care around what we call continuing bonds. And, that there was a time where we would talk about grief and expect that people have a loss and then get over it and move on, have closure and move on. And thankfully, we've kind of moved away from that. And we understand and recognize that even when someone dies, our relationship with them doesn't. Like we stay in relationship, have a connection with that person that extends beyond their death. And that's in all kinds of ways in terms of our choices and our values and our interests and our preferences. But also, I would think of your work around dreams and connections that we feel that kind of extend beyond this world. And so when I think of like the virtual reality headset, I think of the continuing bonds work. And at first we kind of went over continuing bonds are fantastic. It's universally good. Let's talk and support that. And then we began to see there are ways that that continuing bond can really interfere with and disrupt a kind of reintegration with life as it is in the aftermath of big loss. And so I think similarly with virtual reality, like, wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to sink into something where I can engage with my Nana, who was my person who's died, and have a conversation or just let her know how much I love her or give her an update about my life. But I wouldn't want to stay there. And I think for some of us and with some relationships, the pull to stay there would be really strong. And so again, like, what are the safeguards? What's the education? What can we do to make sure that these new possibilities and potentials for us are serving us well in our kind of humanity and in our ongoing life, and not pulling us out of life and putting us in some other realm, world, I don't know,
Yeah.
permanently.
No, I agree. And you said like anytime there's something new that happens, people will get involved in it, and it's going to impact them. And that's going to be its own kind of then therapy on how to get people outside of that again, right? To like detach from that world that they put themselves in for the most part to avoid the pain of the reality. And so
Mhm.
that's one of the things I do kind of like about the dreams people have of the deceased. Like you can't just like call them. They happen like without any kind of conscious awareness of like there's no
Mhm.
guidance of them. It just happens. And so I like that approach where it's very random in a way. because if I'd have so many people that would say, oh, I would like do it all the time, or I'd like pay to be able to do it. And like, so you could just tell there's this longing for it to come faster and they would do it more often. But for whatever reason, that's not the point, right? The point isn't to always have this. For whatever reason, the function is to have these moments when you have them and then not have them at other points. It's still interesting on when we kind of get those, but I feel that there's a benefit that we don't have them all the time, right? I think there's something like just within us that knows that that's not a good idea either. Yeah, interesting. Very interesting conversation. So getting back to the website, I'm happy you guys have done this. And so it's aboutgrief.ca, so people can go. There's a lot of really interesting articles on there. And I love the webinars you do where you can ask questions to experts, also professional. You can, as a griever in the general public, but also as a professional. And you do different topics, like even pet loss. I remember being on there. And so I think that's a very beautiful thing that people can continue to be a part of, but also watch some of the webinars you've done, because there's a lot of questions that would answer for them also. It's a great teaching tool. So I'm happy all that's built in there. So it's like a one-stop shop for everything you need to know.
I'm so glad you raised the grief chats, Joshua, because it was my favorite part of the work that we did. And of course, part of that is because I got to be involved in it. But it was just wonderful to be talking with people from across the country about their experience of grief and what their needs were and what their questions were, and really being reminded of how widely we all struggle with what is normal, what should I be doing, how do I grapple with this, how do I talk about it with others, how do I get myself out of the house? All of those really important core hard questions about grief came up again and again in the grief chats. And yeah, it was just a really, for me, satisfying, meaningful dialogue with the country about grief.
I remember when you first did it, I was really curious. I thought it was such a unique idea that I'm like, why hasn't anyone else done something like this? Like, this is such a great idea, just in general. So I remember watching a few. I'm like, this is awesome. Is nice how people could, submit their questions beforehand, and then you and your colleague, was it Maxine? Yeah, Maxine. Yeah, were able to answer the questions, and you gave different kind of perspectives based on your understanding of grief. And I thought it was like so well done. I was actually really impressed, and so I tell people about it as much as I can because it's such a great resource that's free that people can go to, and also feel like like a lot of times we go to a support group to hear the voices of other people and their questions, and it kind of normalizes some of ours. And this does the same thing. It's like being in a kind of like a support group in a way where you hear everyone else's voices on like questions they have, and you're listening in to say, oh, that's different than mine. Oh, I do have that, or I don't like. So it's really nice to just being informing about grief, but also normalizing our own.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's reassuring to hear the stories of other people's grief. And I think, I had a number of people, even just through my hospice, who would come up to me and say, I've been going to the grief chats, they've been a lifesaver. And it's been so helpful to be able to hear those stories. And I think even as a participant, I know many people kind of came multiple times. And I think hearing those questions be asked and hearing Maxine and I respond to them over and over, again, kind of helps to kind of sink in, like, where I'm at is okay. I'm not the only person. Here are some resources or strategies that I can hold in mind. And it really, I think, helps to kind of ease some of that, again, really intense distress and disruption that comes in early grief for people.
It's nice you've got that feedback, because it's just like in a profession like this, it can be very heavy, but it's really nice when you see what you're doing matters. I think that's always a beautiful thing that I see, even also in the field, is that a lot of people say, oh, that's such a hard job. I'm like, well, there's a lot of love and a lot of like light and hope that's being promoted through the work. And so it gives me like meaning also that, we're helping people live lighter in the world, not as heavy. So do you see that? Do you ever reflect back and say like, wow, like this is I'm glad this is helping. I'm glad like when you hear those stories, does it still warm your heart and say, yeah, like this is why I'm doing it?
Oh, it massively. Absolutely. And, when I think, Joshua, I'm 30 years in to this kind of work, palliative care and grief counseling, it's really reassuring to get even just once in a while, like, this mattered, or this thing you said, I wrote down and I've told 3 other people, just to be reminded that, yeah, the presence and care and experience that we bring is having an impact on people that kind of helps them move through and navigate their lives more easily. I mean, I think illness and loss is a heavy and hard time for sure. But when you can be that little beacon or drop some kind of quote or comment that people really can hang on to and use as a bit of a roadmap for themselves. That's what it's all about.
I love that. And so I'm curious about if you have any experiences for yourself when it comes to a dream of the deceased, or do you hear this a lot where people bring up maybe some of the dreams, positive or negative, that they have in therapy?
Hmm. Hmm. I was thinking about my own grief dreams, and I'm touching wood, fortunate at this time to not have a recent loss that's coming up for me. So I don't think I have my own grief dream story to share at this time. I'm sure I will somewhere in the future, and I'll be reaching out to you. But I can say for sure that dreams are really important in people's lives who are grieving. And I think again, it's that continuing bond connection. Like we want to feel like there's a way in which we're still connected, in contact with our person or thing that we've lost. And so dreams are a big part of people's grief experience. And kind of as you were touching on early on when you were talking about it, Joshua, I feel really aware of, and I'm not a researcher like you are, but just anecdotally from my practice, kind of two things: how painful it is for people when they're not having dreams of their person they lost, and the kind of despair, frustration, sadness about that. And then how most often it's incredibly reassuring when they do come. Like I wouldn't say universally positive, but almost. Like usually when people are coming into their dreams, at least as I'm hearing as a grief counselor, people are making sense of those dreams in a way that is reassuring, is validating, kind of helps them to kind of carry on in the moment in their time of loss. So important. And then the other thing, it's kind of a question back for you that I wonder about, Joshua. And again, anecdotal, not research. But one of the things I notice as a clinician is that it seems to me that when grieving people are really intensely and desperately seeking that person to show up in their dreams or give them a sign, it doesn't happen. And when people kind of release their grip on, I want a dream, I want them to show up in my dream, or I need a sign, when they kind of loosen that expectation or wish, they start to come. And I don't know what that's about. I don't know if we're just too locked in and making the window too narrow, that it's hard for those to show up in our unconscious or in our waking life as signs. But it's something I really notice anecdotally, that and in particular early on in grief, when people are in a lot of pain and distress and really seeking that ongoing connection, it doesn't tend to be there. So I just wonder, in your research or your experience, Joshua, if you notice anything similar or different even.
Yeah, I've heard stories like that, even in our own research, like the research I've done. And what it could be is that people are dreaming of the deceased in a negative context when they're grieving so heavily. So it could be the mind's way of protecting them from that trauma, to like, it would just make it harder.
Interesting.
And so maybe
Yeah.
it takes a little longer because that's when grief is maybe digested a little bit, and they can also have a dream that is kind of more comforting. I always ask people, like, if they're wanting, like, if they really want one, I always like to ask, what would you want? Like, what is it that you're really longing for? And if it is, oh, I just want to make sure if they're spiritual, I just want to make sure they've crossed over. Well, can you ask anyone else if they've had any dreams of them? And they may have, right? And so those other people around you can also provide you that guidance to reassure you, and just know that the dreams will probably come at some point. Like most people, if you're dreaming in a regular way, you're going to have it probably within the first year. I think some like studies, 75 or 80% of people are having within that time frame. And so, but if you're worried, if you want it sooner than later, just ask people around, because one of them probably have had a dream, and that could comfort you to say, oh, okay, yeah. One of the things I heard is that when people don't get dreams, they'll rush and then they'll go to a medium to try to figure out where they are. And I always like to tell people, like, there's no like association that like tests these people. And so you're, putting your mental state in someone else's hands, that it's a monetary business for the most part. And so you have to really go with a critical eye. But if you're longing for that, you might get something that's going to cause you distress. Because I've heard people go and have negative moments with someone like that, where they have to pay more, or they say the deceased is trapped, or there's so many things that can happen. Then you'll like become a victim of them just, taking advantage of you. But really what it stems from is they want a dream, they didn't have it. And so I kind of like try to reassure people that it's going to come in time. Like mine came 3 months after my dad died. And other people that I've heard, when there is this delay, It is, they haven't really acknowledged the loss. Like they avoid going to, there's avoidance still being a part of it. So they'll not go,
Yeah.
there's no interest to go to, let's say, the cemetery because they'll make it too real for them. But I've also heard when they did go, the dreams started happening. And so I feel avoidance is part of it, but also their dream recall in general. And so it's one of the things we found in the research is that when you dream more in general, you're more likely to capture these dreams of the deceased too. So a lot of times people just don't dream a lot. And so, especially in our culture that minimizes dreams, we may remember one or two a week. And so you'll have a less likely chance of actually remembering those dreams of the deceased because you're not remembering your dreams that often, but you're probably dreaming about them. I think that's the wild thing for me is that people are probably dreaming of the deceased a lot more than they're actually remembering it. And so it's like, why do we remember certain ones over others? Like, what do those moments mean? And how can we make sense of the ones we do remember? And so it's a really
Mhm.
fascinating and interesting field. But yeah, it's just like that need and that rush to try to get answers sooner. But there's different ways to sort of, I think, work with that, especially so like asking other people about their dreams is just a common way. And then, yeah, you may feel jealous that they've had it and you haven't, but now you've answered that question. But now you can then work on the jealousy part. And then you can also sort of hear some of the research to let you realize that it's not you. And a lot of times people will take it on like, oh, I've done something wrong, or they have guilt or shame. And that's why I'm not getting a dream. And I always like to reassure people that's not the case. Like I've seen enough to know that that's not really the reason for that. And so, yeah, it's just it's a very interesting question though about how people can try to rush the process.
I've learned so much. I'm so glad I asked you, Joshua. I've got probably 3 things I'm going to take into my clinical practice thanks to your response. Yeah, it's a tricky thing, right? People really want that connection and want to rush it. And I think in particular early on when they're in a lot of distress. And one of the things that you said that's really staying with me is what if it's self-protective? You know, what if the brain is kind of holding that out because right now our thoughts and memories of the person who's died are really painful.
You see that a lot actually. So 40% just in the sample that we've done had negative dreams of the deceased, and they tend to happen earlier on. Versus
Mhm.
most people do tend to have positive dreams also, but there's still that 40% of people who are having these dreams that they're negative in nature. And so I think they would happen more openly in the beginning of loss, but also you may know more than this than me. For prolonged grief, I would think people were having more negative dreams of the deceased, if anything, because I think those positive dreams help shift people in a different light.
Yeah. Yeah. And in particular around prolonged grief and dreams is avoidance. You know, I what the other piece that really stayed with me that you were sharing is around like where are people in terms of digesting or integrating the loss? And I think in prolonged grief or disordered grief, there's a lot of avoidance of those things, those cues in the world that are kind of compelling us to take in that it's happened. Typically in prolonged grief, we really are keeping out the reality in all kinds of ways. And so that, yeah, that really stuck with me about what you said.
Yeah, and be interesting. I've recently read some research on like PTSD and like the dreams they have, and like if you work on the dreams, you can actually reduce the symptoms by a lot. Because it's like such a the dreams trigger the traumatic responses, and it kind of like filters. Yeah. So when you stop the part of them having those dreams and you gain them a sense of control over their dreaming life, it actually reduces the symptoms. And so I'm like, oh, I wonder if the same thing happens with prolonged grief is like if people are having these nightmares, if we work with the dreams, will that reduce the symptoms of prolonged grief disorder? Because a lot of times we focus on the symptoms and not like the dreaming or the sleeping. But like if you do it the opposite, we're like, what's the effects of that? Anyways, those are like some of my thoughts as as I process
We've
it.
got another conversation to have.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so let's get back to this. And so you have not had any dreams yet, which is I think very interesting in general. But hey, there's always time. So if you do have a dream, please let me know. And so if you could have a dream, let's say tonight, of someone who has died, who would that be and what would that look like?
I think I would probably have a dream with my favorite dead person, which is my Nana. I talked about her earlier. Uh, I think I would just like to have a conversation with her about her impact and influence in my life as I see it now, 20 years after her death. Just to let her know that she had a lasting impact, that I'm grateful for the things that she showed me, that she taught me about people, about family, and to kind of just wish her well, send her love, let her know we're doing okay. And most importantly, just to acknowledge and express thanks for how she shaped me.
That's beautiful. And would you want her to be a younger version of herself or the version that you knew her as?
Ooh, that's a fantastic question. I just default thought of her at the age she was when she died. I would have loved to known her before I existed. My Nana, lived through lots of hardship early in her life. So I'd love to talk to her about that, especially as a grief person. My Nana's mom died when she was 12 years old, and her dad immediately married their housekeeper. And so I would just love to know from my Nana, like, how was that? How did you make that transition? Where was there space? Was there any space for grieving your mom? All of that stuff.
Wow, it'd be such an interesting dream. Yeah, so if you have that, please let me know. That's so cool. I always like thinking about just also the stories of people who have died, like even my father and stuff, like some of the stories that I didn't know of him. And so when after he died, I started asking, my aunts and uncles and even my grandma, like, who was my father when he wasn't a father, like as a teen and stuff. So I was so interested in that world because all I knew him as was my father. And so it's kind of like what
Yeah.
you're saying too. It's like, who was she and like what did she how did she deal with that, and ask her some questions that now in the space you're at you can ask those and you understand how difficult those life moments were for her and to try to get some new information from her.
I love that. Did you learn anything that surprised you about your dad or anything you loved that you heard?
Yeah, well, I learned a couple things. Some I didn't love, some other things I did love. But yeah, he was a funny guy, and he really valued his, protecting his family when he could. But I think the humor was a big part of it. But also, he has so much trauma, unresolved trauma, and I kind of saw the picture on how it led to the father I knew and who he was, and some
Mm-hmm.
of his substance use issues with alcohol, but I could see it throughout. And I'm like, oh, like this wasn't just like, oh, it was like, oh, he was a father and he started using alcohol to cope. It's like, no, like this is something that happened before because he had so much trauma unacknowledged in this masculine world, and he used to fight a lot, and so to like get out some of that anger and that pain. And so I learned some like those stuff too, which is I think very interesting for me, which helped me understand him more of who I saw.
Yeah. Yeah, so important. And I love how you've shared in that story, Joshua, that you went to other people, like help me know him from a different perspective, and how you were able to take what you learned and inform how you see him.
Hmm. I almost have like a more like one like a 360 view of who he was rather than like a pie slice, which in different roles we're different people. Like I know that, like at work I'm a different person than I am with my friends versus whatever. So it's just nice to get a
Yeah.
better understanding of who he was as a human being rather than just my
Yeah.
father. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so important. It's making me think, when I had my first baby, from the moment my first baby was born, I was determined, working in palliative care and seeing lots of young parents die, that I was going to write to my kids. And I was going to write to my kids about my real experience of being their mother, because I think so much about mothering is like it's all, fuzzy blankets and flowers and sweet. And I wanted to really share the fullness of it. And so I would write to them every week. And I did that with both of my babies until I noticed around the time that they got to be kind of preteens. And then somehow it felt like I got uncomfortable with them knowing my real experience. And so I stopped, and I have never shared these books with them yet. But my thought was, when I die, they'll get these and they'll see kind of who I was in the experience of taking care of them and mothering them. So, you're just making me think about how much as parents, our kids don't really get that full sense of us as human beings and our struggles and our triumphs and what hurts and what feels great and what we're proud of. And so I was trying to be honest about that and that, but there was a time limit for me somehow, and I stopped.
Very interesting, right? Our behaviors are very interesting to look at and talk about.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so thank you so much for coming on the podcast and doing the work you're doing. As I said, it's opening the eyes of many and also a country. And so is there anything else where people can find either you or the Canadian Grief Alliance? Is there, I know there's a website, aboutgrief.ca, but is there any kind of social media that is with that too?
Yeah. Well, I think just to know, Canadian Grief Alliance is on Instagram. We're on LinkedIn, and but probably the easiest and best single go to is just aboutgrief.ca, and the Canadian Grief Alliance information is there as well, and links to our socials.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for being here today.
Okay. Take care. Thank you.